I have Christopher Monckton back again.
I want to congratulate you on running this podcast and on taking the risk of allowing me to do what was, by any standards, a very highly technical presentation. And there were some commenters who said, actually, this is a bit much for your average YouTube audience. But nevertheless, I think it was an interesting experiment. And to summarize the result very briefly, in effect, we have discovered that climate scientists, at a vital point in their calculations of how much global warming we may cause, had forgotten the sun was shining. You see, they say that most of the warming that we cause doesn't come from our direct sins of emission, that is, the CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we emit. It comes instead from a knock-on additional warming known as feedback response, which is triggered by the initial direct warming that our greenhouse gases do cause. And what they didn't realize was that the feedbacks don't just respond to the direct warming that we cause. They also respond to the direct warming caused by the pre-industrial, non-condensing, non-water vapor, nothing to do with us, greenhouse gases. And also, and above all, they respond to the fact that the sun is shining because there is a temperature that you would have on Earth if there were no greenhouse gases in the air at all at the outset, and no feedback processes had yet started to operate. And that temperature is of order 255 Kelvin. And here, as elsewhere, I'm going to be using their figures unless I say otherwise. And they left that out. That is the proper input to the temperature feedback amplifier in climate. And they left it out. They also left out the 8 Kelvin of direct warming by the natural greenhouse gases, which should have been counted as part of what is known as the direct gain block in the feedback circuit, if you imagine it as a kind of electronic circuit. They left both of those out. Now, they thought they could do this because in control theory, the difficult and counterintuitive branch of engineering physics, from which they borrowed the mathematics of feedback amplification in dynamical systems, which are systems that change their state over time in a mathematically representable way, such as rockets or steam engines or the climate. They didn't realize that you have to include that sunshine temperature because they said, well, control theorists often leave out the input signal. Yes, they do in their circuits because it's very, very small. And if you leave it out, it doesn't lead to error. In the climate, the feedback, the direct input signal from the sun, 255 Kelvin, compared with 8 Kelvin of natural greenhouse warming and just 1 Kelvin of anthropogenic greenhouse warming across the whole of the industrial era, that 255 Kelvin input signal from the sun is overwhelmingly predominant, so you can't leave it out. But they do leave it out, and they leave it out universally on both sides of the climate debate. So you're now speaking to somebody who is deeply unpopular with the climate communists, as I call them, with more than a little justifications, but also unpopular with the climate skeptics, because many of the leading climate skeptic professors have themselves made this mistake in their scientific papers. And so nobody loves me except you.
So this is a fundamental error in climate science. What do you think the effect will be on the climate debate as this becomes more known, what you're saying here?
Well, it's very interesting what's beginning to happen here. And that is that gradually this result is being whispered in the corridors of impotence. They've begun to realize that this is a problem. And they really don't know how to deal with it because it is arguably the central error in climatology, in its analysis of how much warming we may cause. It's a big one. You know, if you leave out the largest temperature signal by 2 orders of magnitude, which is the sunshine, from your feedback calculations, then you will just get meaningless outputs. And it is precisely because of that meaningless output that they think that feedback response multiplies the original direct warming, which is only about 1 Kelvin over the whole of the last 250 years, by anything up to 5 times over. And that's how they get these big numbers that then panic governments into shutting down the West. So the effect of this, and we're hoping eventually to get it published not just in the proceedings of a learned climate conference where it's published at the moment, but also in one of the leading climate journals that the true believers in climate science themselves read, a climate journal that has itself until now done nothing except publish papers championing the official party line. And if this journal finally cracks and says, okay, the game's up, we're going to publish this, that is going to cause shockwaves right through the industry. They've been trying to suppress this for about a decade now. And the most recent attempt we made last year, for instance, to get a journal in Oxford to publish this was fascinating. There were 40 pages of exchanges between me and the reviewers, at the end of which it became entirely clear, because what they didn't know is that the conversation was being silently moderated by an eminent emeritus professor at Oxford, who, at the end of it all, got me to send a complete written account of what both sides had said. And he read through it and he said, I have never been more ashamed of my university. They have paid utter disregard to science. They have taken what is plainly a purely political decision to prevent this paper being published. And I am going to write to the Vice-Chancellor about it. And he wrote to her 3 times without reply. And this is one of the most eminent emeritus professors in the world in his subject, which is geology. And I won't name him because they bully him if you as you know, if one gives their name, but he's very, very eminent, and she still didn't even reply. Eventually, I made a formal complaint to the registrar of the university under their research integrity procedure, which, as you can imagine, is a kind of communistic bureaucratic procedure. And I said the reviews were not worth the paper they were printed on. They were clearly just intending to stop this result from becoming known. What are you going to do about it? And he did not reply within the timescale that was provided for in his own rules. So I was talking to another eminent professor, and he said, right, what you want to do is write him a letter before claim in judicial review. And that will sharpen him up. And sure enough, within 24 hours of my sending that letter, they replied, and they said, yes, we will start the compliance process, which they then did. And he wrote to me a very short letter at the end of that saying, we have decided that all the appropriate procedures were followed. But our complaint wasn't about the procedures. It was about the intrinsic merits of the reviews themselves. And I think that what had happened was that they did get it looked at by a third party who will have said, actually, yes, this is a complete haulix. You've made a mess of this. You better let him publish the paper. But they didn't want to do that. And so they just said, oh, well, all the procedures have been complied with. So that's what we're up against. Academia has become thoroughly corrupted. It's not just in this subject either. It's a much more widespread thing. And again, I will use the word communist, and again, I will use it advisedly and not carelessly. There has been deliberate, systematic, and now systemic communist penetration of our universities in the West. And I was a Cambridge man, and even before I got there, there were communist spooks being arrested and locked up because they'd given secrets to the Russians. So this is now a serious problem. The universities are not functioning as they should. The various climate journals are not functioning as they should. This is not a level playing field. It's not really science that these people are doing. It is communist politics. And so it's going to be, I think, very difficult for us to get this result published in one of their journals, which is the only way they'll ever take any notice of it. But we're going to continue to try, because gradually we are educating more and more and more of the other side in this result. And there will come a kind of point, don't know how long it will take, where a critical mass will be reached, and they'll realize that they cannot any longer hold up their heads high and say the science is settled, when it plainly isn't, and when they know it isn't. And when that moment comes, in my submission, this central error that they have made is such a lulu, it's such a large one, it's such an obvious one, forgetting that the sun is shining. You use that phrase, and even a lay audience will at once understand that we're dealing with a very large error. And at that point, I think it'll unravel quite quickly. I can give you a little background on this because Donald Trump, his office got in touch during his first administration, and they said, oh, we've read a paper by you in the journal of the Science Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and you had hinted there that you had found a large error which had led them to believe that global warming will be large and dangerous rather than small and net beneficial, as it's proving to be. Could you please tell us whether you've managed to progress with this? I said, yes, we've now found out what the error is. We knew there was one at that time. We hadn't yet pinned it down. Now we've pinned it down. So I was asked to send a one-page brief to Donald Trump, which I sent. And within 1 week, he had pulled America out of the Paris Climate Agreement. And I don't know whether you've yet seen the whinging legal documents sent on behalf of various below-age children to the county court in Butte, Montana, saying that Donald Trump's executive orders about the climate are invalid and illegal and immoral and fattening. Well, they have whinged to the effect that Donald Trump is going against science by making this order, and therefore endangering the futures of the children who are the plaintiffs in this case. Well, setting aside the undesirability of exploiting children in this way, the fact is that Donald Trump knew exactly what he was doing, because when he got my one-page note on how this works, he sent that to his scientists, and they checked it. They found it to be correct, and it was then and only then, and within just a week, because he doesn't hang about, as you may have noticed, he pulled America out of the Paris Climate Accords for the first time, and he has now done it again for the second time. The Russians are also aware of our result, because before they invaded the Ukraine, I was asked to go to Moscow to brief the deputy head of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He was fascinated. He called up the IPCC's representative, said, come and see us. I want you to explain this to the IPCC's representative. He couldn't refute it. So he then got me to brief Russia's chief modeler, and they rewrote the Russian climate model. It's the only one that doesn't overpredict global warming. So gradually this result is being known very widely. And that's why when you get nincompoops like, say, Miliband, who, you know, the unit of idiocy is the Miliband. He is our Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, or tautology, as I call it. You can't have both. He, of course, wouldn't understand any of this. But he goes around saying that if we demonstrate enough climate leadership, as he calls it, trashing our economies, somehow this will inspire nations like Russia, China, India, Pakistan, all of whom know of our result and know that the whole climate thing is nonsense, to follow their example and trash their economies too. Well, it's not going to happen. So you can see that our result is already having a worldwide effect. So even though on the whole in the Western countries, so thoroughly communized is academia and the research journals and so forth, and the politicians largely, that they simply can't countenance so countercultural a result as ours. In the communist countries themselves, they are very well aware of it, and that's why they will pay lip service to this climate nonsense for the sake of getting us to trash our economies so that they can replace our economic and therefore political hegemony worldwide with their own, which is very rapidly happening. But in the West, we still haven't woken up. So I think the main effect of our paper will be to wake up the West to the fact that it has been fooled on this climate question, and it's time to wake up and smell the coffee.
So you laid out your case clearly in April on this podcast. It got over 15,000 views. And there were some people who are supposed to be climate skeptics who pushed back in the comments. Do you want to address any of those comments here?
That's a very, very interesting question. Glad you thought of it. And I think in particular, there were two who we won't name because it wouldn't be fair to them since they're not on the other end of this conversation. One of them I will simply call the born liar. He knows who he is. And the other I will call needs to raise his game, and he knows who he is. And both of these have notoriously tried to interfere with our result over the years. Both of them pretending to be skeptics, but they're not actually skeptics. Both of them have used techniques which, when I was in my James Bond phase, I learnt to recognize. I was taught to recognize the techniques that they're using. And I was taught not to use them because they're very dishonest techniques, but I was taught that one needs to be able to recognize them. So these people are doing things that, if you like, hostile agents of influence would be doing in the West. And indeed, I met one of these characters the other day, not one of these two, but another Russian agent of influence. And he didn't know that I knew that he was getting briefings from the Federal Security Bureau, as it's now called. It's essentially the OKGB, which is centered in Britain in the so-called press office in the Russian embassy. And so he tried to say to me, you do realize, don't you, that Putin is absolutely right about Ukraine? And I said, no, he isn't. And he said, but you do accept Putin is popular in Russia. I said, well, there is one thing he's popular for. He's managed to get control of the national debt. He has a pathological hatred of national debt. He's got it down to a very reasonable level despite the cost of the war in Ukraine. And that is going to be hugely beneficial to Russia. I said, I'll give him a good point for that. But invading our continent, no, he shouldn't be doing that. And then he said, would you like to meet Mr. Putin? Which was a fairly good giveaway that he was indeed the agent of influence that I knew him to be. And I suspect that these two that pounced immediately, as soon as this video by me went up, they'd obviously got me tagged so that wherever this idea pops up, they'll come in and attack it. And so the first of them said, oh, well, what you've done is improper extrapolation. And this is one of their standard lines. Whenever somebody says something skeptical, they say, oh, that's improper extrapolation. They get away with that because your average politician doesn't even know what extrapolation is. And most scientists sort of don't realize that our result, in fact, doesn't depend on extrapolation at all. It works the other way. We use a technique which was pioneered by the late Professor R.V. Jones, who was the head of scientific intelligence for about 30 years. And I knew him very well and worked with him on a number of projects. And he used to lecture his students where he was professor of natural philosophy in the University of Aberdeen. And he gave a famous lecture called The Other Way About. And what he would do is to work backwards from a result to see what the initial conditions that would give you that result would look like. He said, if you do that, it's very revealing. So that's what we did. We said, okay, the IPCC has been saying since 1990 that there will be between 2 and 5 Kelvin or Celsius of global warming as a result of doubling the CO2 in the air. And so we worked back from that to find out what would be the values of the originating feedback variable in the climate, which is called feedback intensity or feedback strength. That would give you 2 to 5 Kelvin of global warming. And the answer was that the difference between the bottom end of that range and the top end of the range of feedback intensity was 0.03 units of feedback intensity. But the published uncertainty in feedback intensity in the IPCC, you can look it up if you want, it's 2021 report, table 7.10, is 1.3 units, not 0.03. So once you put the sunshine temperature back in as your input signal, the feedback intensity becomes minuscule. And therefore, because of the large uncertainty in what it actually is, you cannot use feedback analysis at all to predict global warming. So there's no extrapolation in that argument at all. And he just didn't want to know that. So when we had put him to bed on that one. It took a couple of goes, and he eventually realized he wasn't going to get anywhere pursuing that, because I've been quite actively responding to these comments, as you will have noticed. He then said, oh, well, what you've been doing is sometimes you use a unit direct gain factor, or it's known as the open loop gain factor in control theory, and sometimes you're using a above unity. And of course, this shows inconsistency, but he hadn't even watched the lecture, because what I had said was there are 3 different ways of doing it. There are 2 which are kind of the right way. One, which is the absolutely correct method, which gives you a slightly above unity direct gain factor. The other, slightly less correct, but it'll still give you more or less the same answer, where you can simply take the gain signal to be unity, and then you simply add the direct gain signals to the input signal. So instead of 255 Kelvin, it goes up to 255 plus 8 plus 1, which is 264. And then you get very much the same result at the other end. I said you can do either of those. And the reason why we showed the second one at all, which is where you have this unit open loop gain factor, is that's exactly what climatology does, except that it also forgets to put the sunshine temperature in. So you get a better comparison between the corrected way and the uncorrected way if you make that little change. So it's completely harmless. But he didn't watch the lecture. He didn't understand it. He realized he'd lost his main point. So he was simply thrashing about and trying something else instead. And the same pattern happened with needs to raise his gain, because now, what he tried to do is to say that the feedback processes in the climate are necessarily net negative and not net positive. And so the first and obvious answer to that is, in that case, our case is proven a fortiori, because if feedback is net negative, we start off with only a very small direct warming, then you're going to give even less warming than that small direct warming, in which case closed. But it gets better than that, because we know that in 1850, the feedback signal in the climate, the feedback response, was strongly net positive. It was 25 Kelvin, but it was 25 Kelvin in response to 255 plus 8, 263 Kelvin at that time, before we'd had any of our own warming. And therefore, it was still very small beer, but it was positive. So we said that, and he still whittled on about it. So then we said, actually, our result does not depend on whether or not feedback is net positive or net negative. What it does say is you can't use feedback analysis at all to predict global warming, because the feedback intensity is going to be applied to the entire reference signal, which is 264 Kelvin today, and not just to the 1 Kelvin of direct warming by doubling CO2, or the equivalent to that. So therefore, it's going to be a very, very small feedback signal. And what's more, any change in that is going to have a still smaller effect, but it is magnified by the fact that it is applied to that entire big reference signal before you take into account feedback. And for that reason, because you cannot say exactly what that feedback intensity is, you cannot use feedback analysis to predict global warming at all. Whether the feedback is positive or negative is entirely, when our result does not concern itself with that. We derive our values of ECS, equilibrium doubled CO2 equivalent sensitivity, by methods other than feedback analysis, because feedback analysis can tell you nothing, absolutely nothing, about how much global warming we may cause. And then there was he then also came back with a subsidiary point when he'd lost his main point. And he said, oh, but you took no account of time variance in feedback intensity compared with 1850. Except that, of course, we did. And we actually used, admittedly, this would have been difficult for this particular guy. We had to use multivariate calculus. First of all, you plot the curve of equilibrium double CO2 equivalent sensitivity against the feedback intensity. And then for any given feedback intensity, you have to take the slope of the curve, which is the derivative in calculus. And it had to be multivariate calculus at that. So it's not for everybody, I agree. But of course, we therefore took full account of the possibility of time variance in our result. And that is very plainly stated in the paper, which I hope by now you have read and are willing to be tested on. So again, you saw these two people using the similar technique. They start off with a big objection, that gets knocked out of court. They then come back with smaller ones. And so Needs to Raise His Game also said, oh, but you've confused the reference and the operating point. Except that we hadn't. The reference point is before you add any feedback response. The operating point is after the feedback response is added and the climate has resettled to equilibrium. And both of those have their own separate variables in our paper, as in any climate paper. But you see, he just didn't care whether he was telling the truth. They just make this stuff up so as to try to create an air of unease and uncertainty around our result in the hope that they can keep this wretched scam going until they finally collapse the economies of the West. So neither of these had any serious points to make. And there were one or two other points that were sort of glancing blows that other people made, but none of them was very serious. So I think it's fair to say that of all the various comments, most of them were handsomely net kindly towards what we'd been trying to do. But the very few that took a different line, none of them, as we would say, landed a blow on our result at all.
So you've been working on this for years, and I'm trying to understand the state of both awareness and acceptance in the scientific community. Are you getting some support behind the scenes from people, or publicly are you getting support?
That is very, very interesting. Now, publicly, I don't think we can expect support yet because it's too early. This is the trouble with control theory, is that it's intensely counterintuitive. It's very difficult. And the only reason why I was able to understand it is that I was trained in Cambridge in classical mathematics. And classical mathematics has techniques that are simply not known to your average climatologist. And it's a rather interesting tale, actually, because if we go back to Archimedes of Syracuse, you're too young to remember, but he was a formidable Greek mathematician, eventually got killed by a loutish Roman soldier. And one of the things that he worked on in his pre-calculus phase, for it was he who invented calculus, as we now know, long before Newton and Leibniz came along, he wanted to find out what was the area subtended by a random second line of the parabola. And in effect, he found and all the Greek mathematicians did their mathematics by using geometry. And so he found a marvelous way of dividing up the area under the second line of the parabola into a series of triangles. And each group of triangles had an area which was 1/4 of the group above it. And you get all the way down until you've filled the entire space under the parabola. And he then found that gave you an infinite series of powers of 1/4. And he worked out that the answer was 4/3. And it wasn't until about 2,500 years later that somebody came along and said, actually, yes, this is a general result, and there is a closed form sum, which will give you the sum of an infinite geometric progression of that type. And you can have any value you like of that common ratio, which in the climate, broadly speaking, is the feedback factor. And you can take all the powers of that and add them up, and you can know immediately what the answer is without adding them up. And so that turned out to be the key to understanding what climatologists had got wrong, because they didn't realize this. They didn't realize that the typical Archimedean geometric progression comprises a first term, which in climate is the reference temperature, which of course 97% of that is the sunshine temperature. And the rest of it is the common ratio, which is strictly speaking the product of the two blocks in the feedback loop. It's the gain block, the direct gain block at the top with the open loop gain factor, and then you have the feedback factor. The product of those is your common ratio. And so at every point, if you think of the climate feedback amplifier as an electronic circuit, because the mathematics is exactly the same for all feedback moderated dynamical systems, so you can do that. What you find is that it all comes out very, very tidily, that every single circuit through the round of the feedback loop, through each of those two blocks, the direct gain and feedback blocks, will the signal will be acted upon by that feedback block. And the signal that is being acted upon, of course, is the reference signal. That's the first term in that geometric progression, and 97% of that reference signal is the sunshine temperature. And that's why you cannot at any moment leave it out. You could if it was tiny, but you can't because it's so overwhelmingly predominant. And once people get that Archimedean geometrical progression and how it works, and it's actually made explicit in our paper. If you go to equation 22, I think it is in the paper, you'll see this rather long expansion that explains all this. And any well-trained mathematician, even with no better than high school math, on seeing that equation, would at once recognize what was going on, would realize why you cannot ever leave out the sunshine. And yet we have a supplementary note, which I don't think I sent to you, where we've gone through sort of 30 or 40 leading papers in climate feedback analysis. Not one of them has that sunshine temperature in as the input signal. We can't find a single paper anywhere in climatology that gets this right. The moment you realize that sunshine temperature has to be there, then it's all over bar the shouting. That is absolutely it. However, bit by bit, I'm being able to talk to scientists increasingly outside the climate field, because they often do have the necessary mathematics, in particular, theoretical physicists. For instance, a very eminent theoretical physicist was introduced to me the other day from the States. Again, no names, because I don't want them to be howled at by the screamers. But he had a really good look at it. And he said, yes, this is self-evidently correct. And then I was put in touch with another eminent theoretical physicist from MIT. And he said, oh, but you've confused Kelvin and Celsius. And that was his opening bit. I said, no, we haven't. And so then he had a closer look, and he started raising a series of questions, all of which I answered. The correspondence went on for about 3 weeks. It was like talking to a reviewer, if you like. But at the end of it, he said, now I see it, he said. He said, this result is groundbreaking. Of course it ought to be published. Of course it's correct. And he was a very, very eminent theoretical physicist. The great thing about theoretical physicists, they really do know their mathematics, which your average climatologist kind of basically doesn't. Then there was, of course, the professor from Oxford who had heard about our result, because it is beginning to circulate in samizdat among the scientific community. And he said, this has got to be nonsense. They couldn't have made a mistake as big as that. I want to see him. So I was summoned to Oxford. And I took him out to lunch and explained it to me. He said, well, superficially, I can't see from your explanation anything wrong with it. But he said, I'm going to need to see the paper. So I sent it to him. And within a day, he'd read the whole thing. And he came back to me and he said, this is extraordinary. He said, of course you're correct. He said, of course the paper must be published. So then I went back to see him again and went through the paper with him over his kitchen table, line by line. I said, I want you to really try to find even the smallest solecism. And he couldn't. He said, no, there's nothing wrong with this. And so then I also went to, in fact, this time a skeptical scientist, but a scientist who is not a climatologist and who comes from the Stanford Linear Accelerator Laboratory. You'll probably know who I mean, but again, I'm not going to use names here. And he at first said, well, this is a very specialist area. It's beyond me. I said, well, look, what I'd like you to do is I've spelled out all the equations you need to know. And even though you don't have the frame of reference within which to know whether these are the right equations, if you'll take it from me, just for the sake of argument that they're correct, have I drawn the correct conclusions? And he came back to me and he said, this result is not only correct, it is entirely self-evident. So gradually, by talking to individual scientists, we are beginning to sort of wake them up to the fact that there's this very, very bad smell right at the heart of climatology. So step by step, we're getting there. When you think of the vast and extremely lavishly funded propaganda machine that we are fighting here, we realized very early on in this that trying to do it by debate was not going to be easy because they won't debate. They know they're wrong about this, so they won't debate. But if instead we can just quietly get round scientists until they start talking to each other and saying, actually, this whole climate thing is nonsense, and that's really what our paper establishes, then there will eventually become a critical mass, and it will quietly disappear and go away. It's very interesting reading the pleadings in this Butte, Montana case against Donald Trump's executive orders on the climate. They whinge about his closing down all their climate programs, but you can see that, apart from anything else, it tells you just how many of these damn things were going on, and how much money must have been thrown away on the climate nonsense by the American governmental system. And the very fact that they make so many complaints about it being stopped, I think, is very encouraging, because what this means is that they realize the game's up, and that while there are politicians like Donald Trump who were willing to ask questions, as he did of us, and then to act once his own people had told him, yeah, of course they're right about this, gradually there will be more leaders who do this. I mean, Václav Klaus invited me to the Czech Republic. He's the former president there, just late last year. And I gave a presentation on this to his people. And there were some very, very sharp cookies in there. And they reckoned that this was correct. And he knows me of old, so he knows that I wouldn't waste his time with something unless I was reasonably confident that it was correct. And so at the level of heads of state, we're now also beginning to make some penetration. Now, Mr. Putin knows of our result because he was briefed by the deputy head of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So he knows that climate change is not a thing. And gradually, the word is spreading. And of course, we still have to remain open to the possibility that we have misunderstood something fundamental. But so far, those who have tried to attack us have not been able to do so. In fact, I've just had today another email from another agent of influence, and they write to me, typically a different one each time, about once a year. Every time this result pops up publicly, as it did on your blog very kindly, the next thing that happened was this guy gets on, he says, oh yes, I heard of your result and I think it's wonderful. I'd just like to ask one or two questions. And I recognize that now as the pattern that they use. And then you start replying to them, and then they get more and more ratty and more difficult and more disagreeable. And previously, they've always lost their temper at some point or another. And I've simply said to them, well, I think we'll leave it there. This guy has learnt not to do that. So he's obviously been told, if you're dealing with Monckton, don't lose your temper, because in the end, he'll just go and do other things. He won't waste his time. This guy is remaining polite. Again, no names, no pact drill. But, and he's already had to give up on the main point that he was making, which was that the use of the term lambda in climatology is different from what we're doing. They use it as a feedback parameter, which is a different animal from the feedback intensity. And I've said, in fact, it's used for both. And so he lost that one. So now he's doing exactly what these two people on your thread were doing, then finding other objections that they could try to pile in on. And, I'll keep it going until it eventually becomes boring, then I'll tell him to go and pester somebody else. But the fact that they're trying to demoralize us by doing this is very interesting. And so gradually, I think we are gaining acceptance in the way that every hypothesis gains acceptance, not because we can prove that it is true, though we think that you kind of can in this particular case, because proving a hypothesis to be true is problematic, to say the least. But like all the best hypotheses, it survives scrutiny, and nobody can prove it false. And the longer that goes on, And if you read, say, Karl Popper on what's it, Logik der Forschung, the logic of scientific discovery, it's the best book on this that was ever written. It's just wonderfully clear in the 1950s. And he says, if a hypothesis survives and is attacked from all directions and it still survives, it gains credibility, but that credibility is not proof, because it's very seldom that you can actually prove a hypothesis. We can certainly prove that you can't use feedback you can't use feedback analysis to gain any useful idea of how much warming we may cause. Because if you put the sunshine temperature in, it means that even a very small time variance in feedback intensity will lead to an enormously large temperature response signal, which, however, isn't actually happening in the real climate. We've been running this experiment now for 175 years, and yet if you think there's been about 1 degree of direct warming and another half degree that you could attribute to feedback response, well, that's tiny. And so we know that feedback response isn't a problem, and they can no longer say that it is, because they only get away with saying that it is by using this wrong-headed notion that you must exclude the sunshine temperature, or rather they said they didn't even know that it had to be there. So yes, we think that that has now gained acceptance, and it will gather momentum from now on.
So in your lecture on this channel back in April, you mentioned that your co-authors suffered a great deal when their names were found on a draft of the paper. Did you want to talk about what that meant?
Now, that is, again, a fascinating question. And again, I'm not going to use names, if I may. I know this is sort of less satisfying, but they've gone through hell, and I don't want them to go through hell again. First of all, there was a very eminent solar astrophysicist at the Harvard-Smithsonian Institution. And when his name was found on an earlier version of our paper, which was published in the Science Bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences in 2015, the communist-led environmental group known as Greenpeace, and that became communist-led in December of 1985, when the original founders, including Patrick Moore, were driven out because they weren't political. They were genuine environmentalists. They cared about the whales and the acid rain and stuff. They were not communists, but they were kicked out by communists who took over that and most other environmental groups. As a general rule of thumb in the intelligence community here, we would say that very nearly all environmentalist front groups and climate change front groups of any kind, even though their memberships will be largely well-meaning and innocent people, their leaderships are very nearly always communist-dominated. And so Greenpeace was taken over at that time. And so when they saw this result coming on the horizon, because they know we're right about this, they decided that they would go after this innocent co-author, and they had hostile pieces published about him in Nature and in Science and in the Boston Globe and in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times. And his own institution tried to fire him. And I had to intervene with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who is ex officio chairman of this institution. And I said to him, you must stop this nonsense, because he's done nothing wrong whatsoever. The allegations that Greenpeace were making was that, well, you see, he has taken money from a coal mining company and he hadn't declared it. Well, of course, it turned out that he had declared it. He declared it to his own institution, and they had actually then negotiated a grant from that company and taken the thick end of it for what they call overhead, which is how these universities and so forth have become so rich and fat these days, by pinching the money that the researchers have brought in for themselves. So he himself didn't see very much money out of it. And in any case, he did not spend any of that money or any of the time that that money was allocated to on our paper. He did that entirely privately, and so he wasn't obliged to declare. anything. So I eventually shut it down because they also complained to the journal to try and get the journal to withdraw the paper. And so I got onto the journal and said, this is just nonsense. Don't you dare go down that road. So they accepted the position. So that was what happened to him. And in the end, he just found it impossible to continue at his institution. He was, in effect, driven out. And he now has his own institution, which is producing papers on various subjects at a rate of knots. Then there was another one who was an eminent professor of climatology, former state climatologist. And somebody at his institution found a copy of our paper on his desk, realized how devastating it was, went to the dean of his faculty, then wrote round to all of the faculty, saying what a bad egg he was and making his position just impossible. They'd been doing this to him for years already, but this was the last straw. And he, in the end, he just said to me, look, I can't fight this anymore. And he took early retirement. So that's two knocked out of their institutions. But it gets worse. Then there was another one who is a professor of climatology, professor of control theory. And he had come to us because he had seen a previous YouTube video of mine on our result. And he had written to say, very politely and charmingly, I think you made a mistake. And it was a control theoretic mistake. And he was correct. We had. It wasn't a mistake that in any way changed the bottom line of the result, but it was still a mistake. So I said, right, we will correct that. And what's more, we could do with having our hand held so that we don't make other mistakes, because control theory isn't easy. We've got 3 control theorists already. We haven't got a professor of it, and you're obviously brighter than average. Could you please become a co-author? And so he was delighted to do that. He said, yeah, of course I will. And then his name was found on a copy of our paper, and he was called in by the principal of his institution, which was a university in northern Germany, and he was told, you must take your name off this paper because this university receives a lot of funding for climate change research, and we really don't want this happening. So he said, but so sorry, is there some mistake that we have made in the paper which is so bad that we ought not to proceed with it any further? In which case, of course, I'll tell the lead author and we'll just stop the whole project until we've got it right. Or if it isn't remedial, well, of course we'll stop. And the principal said, we don't care whether it's right or not. You are to take your name off it. And he said no, and he's a young lad with, a wife and 3 children. And he still had the courage to stand up to the principal. And he said, no, I'm going to go to the local administration, the regional administration, which, among other things, has the duty to uphold the integrity of academic research and to allow freedom of speech and research and publication, a freedom which you are trying to deny to me. So he went to them, and they said, we will not determine this matter. So he took them to court and said, you've got to determine this matter. And he won that. And so then they said, well, we don't think you have any right of freedom of speech. And that was the last we heard from him, because we think the principal of his university then said to him, you are not to communicate with them ever again. And so he's fallen completely off the radar, completely silent. That is what is happening to research in our universities today. And the worst of the lot, this is the 4th person who was driven out by his institution. And he was a young lad who was, he had a speech difficulty, difficulty interpreting, because he had his brain wired in a slightly wrong way. And I used to therefore help him with his essays when he was a student at a university here in this country. Again, I won't say which. And I would rewrite his essays for him. He would do the work. I would then rewrite it with a note saying at the bottom, this has been rewritten because I have dyslexia. That's the particular thing that he had. And he was getting very, very high marks. And he actually found a way of predicting the atmospheric rivers that come in and dump vast amounts of warming, of rainfall rather, unpredictably on California. And he found a way of predicting this, so you could tell months in advance that this was going to happen. So he was a very, very clever guy. And just as luck would have it, when an earlier version of our paper was being peer reviewed, it was sent to somebody at that particular university who couldn't refute it. And instead of saying, honestly, yes, this paper is correct, he instead ran to the vice-chancellor of the university and said, my God, this is terrible. This university gets more funding than any other virtually worldwide for climate research. And it turns out the whole thing's nonsense. And so the vice-chancellor, in a panic, called together all 65 members of the environmental sciences faculty at that university. And he said, he shut them all in a lecture hall with him, and he yelled at them so loudly that it could be heard from outside the room, which is how we got to hear about it, and eventually from somebody inside the room as well to confirm it. He said, you are to drop everything and work full-time on refuting this paper. Otherwise, this entire university is out of business. So that was how academia is looking at this. It's a money-making scam, and they don't want it brought to an end. Anyway, they couldn't refute the paper, and they spent months on it, and they stopped teaching their students. The students went on strike because they weren't being taught, their essays weren't being marked, lectures weren't happening, because they were all beavering away trying to refute our paper, which they couldn't in the end do. So the vice-chancellor then rounded on this innocent guy at the university and trumped up a false charge of sexual misconduct and reported him to the police, at which point I was called in. And I demanded that the police should come and see me. And I said, right, this is what's really going on. And here I've investigated in great detail the allegation that was concocted. And here is a 33-page report explaining why it's obvious nonsense. They took one look at that and they dropped the case. They said, yep, it's quite clear. And they did that even though they'd been very crafty the way they set this up. The woman that he was said to have done things with that he shouldn't have done was a trainee policewoman. Even then, the police dropped the case once they realized it simply didn't stack up. It was entirely untrue. The university wouldn't let go. So he then went to America, and on arrival there, he said to me, what do I say to the immigration officers? I said, you tell them exactly what happened. And so this is how the immigration officer reacted. He said, you mean the university sent the police in, the police arrested you, did they charge you? He said, no, they took me to the police station. He said, without charging you? And he said, yes. So yeah, we've heard of this happening in Britain. Not a free country anymore, is it? Welcome to the United States. And he stamped his passport. So, gradually there is an awareness that something has gone really wrong in academia. But that gives you just 4 examples. Of course, they also came after me, but I'm long since retired. There's not much they can do to me. So what they did, I was due to give a talk on all this in Australia, and it was going to be on live TV, debating against a communist who runs a thing called the Heartland Institute, which is a communist front organization. And they realized after they'd nominated him to stand up against me that he didn't know the heck what he was talking about, and they would lose very heavily. So they got onto their communist mates in Britain, who in turn got onto a communist in Parliament, who is an officer of Parliament called the Clerk of the Parliaments. And they said to him, do something to trash Monckton's reputation before he arrives in Australia. So he wrote a letter to me saying I was not allowed to call myself a peer of the realm. I was not allowed to call myself a member of the House of Lords. I was not allowed to use the symbol of the House of Lords, and that if I went on doing this, there would be trouble. But he didn't send the letter to me. He sent it to the news media. The first I heard of it was when I got to Australia, and news media began ringing up and saying, oh, the Clerk of the Parliament says you're not a real Lord. And I said, well, the Clerk of the Parliament doesn't know what he's talking about. And they said, no, but you're using the symbol of the House of Lords. I said, he really doesn't know what he's talking about. Then I don't use the symbol of the House of Lords. I use the portcullis, which is part of the symbol of the House of Lords, but that's a generic heraldic device, which I am uniquely entitled to use because I'm descended from the de Beaufort family, who in 1289, I think it was, first adopted the portcullis as their symbol, and I surmount it not with the crown royal, which would make it Parliament's symbol, but with the coronet vice-comital, which I am entitled to. I'm one of only 29 people in the world that is. And more recently, they thought they'd have another go. So the clerk of the Parliament got in touch again and said, I hear you're still using that symbol. I said, yes, I am, and I'm entitled to, because the press last time your office whinged about this, they got in touch with Garter, King of Arms, who's in charge of all heraldic devices in Britain. And he said, well, that's not registered to anybody else. He's perfectly entitled to use it. So I told the clerk of the Parliament to shut up and go back in his box, and I've not heard from him since. But these are the childish games they play. If they can take down one's reputation, they somehow think that one's arguments will lose force and strength. But that's not how science works. In the end, science works by diligently subjecting prior hypotheses to new results and new ways of thinking, and so as to improve them, or if necessary, to falsify them. Because although you cannot usually prove a hypothesis, you can always disprove one if it's wrong. And that is what we say we have done.
So for people who want to actually read your paper, should they email you for a copy of it? Is that still the best way to do it?
That would be the easiest thing to do it. Monckton@mail.com. That's MONCKTON@mail.com. And I maintain this as a public email, so feel free to write in. That's no problem at all. And I'll gladly send it to you. And again, feel free to go through it. And if there's something wrong, please tell us. We're not here to say we are the last word in this. Yes, we think we've found what is the fundamental error that led them to think that global warming was a problem. And it's pretty clear that after correction of this error, there's no good evidence that it's a problem. And all the mounting evidence is that actually the enrichment of the atmosphere with CO2 is greatly improving the plant life on Earth. In fact, the biomass of all trees and plants on Earth has not fallen over the last 33 years. It's increased by somewhere between 15 and 30%. And we know that the direct cause of that is CO2 fertilization, because we measure that by way of monitoring what's called chlorophyll fluorescence by satellites from space. So we know that that is why we're getting this luxuriant growth in trees and plants. And it's no surprise, therefore, that the harvest of agricultural crops worldwide reached another record high just last year and is likely to be exceeded again this year, although some of that is attributable to modern agricultural methods and fertilization, the Haber-Tropsch process, and so on. Fact is, some of it is also attributable to CO2. And the one thing we can say is that CO2 is certainly not making things worse for the harvest. It's definitely making it better. So there are many good points about CO2 which tend to get left out of the debate. And this, I think, is something that's now got to change. Scientists have got to learn that you must look carefully at both sides of the argument and not just cling, for reasons of politics or profit, to the side that you happen to find congenial, or in which, increasingly these days, you've simply been indoctrinated at school and at university.
So is there anything at all we can learn about your work by looking at the temperature on other planets other than Earth to try to sanity check it?
It's very, very difficult to do that, partly because the temperature measurements on Earth are uncertain enough. If you then get into trying to measure the temperature on other planets, the uncertainty becomes so large that you can draw no useful conclusions. And also, you would need to have a pretty good idea of the atmospheric composition in those planets and how it's changed over time, in order to get some idea of the time variance in feedback intensity. And of course, we simply don't have those measurements. So no, that doesn't, it's a very good question, but no, that I don't think at the moment, I can't see a way of using other planets to back this up. I mean, you can look at Venus and say, oh, look, it's got lots of CO2 in the atmosphere and it's very hot, but it's also very much closer to the sun than we are, so to be hot anyway. And yes, the fact that there's a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere makes a big difference there, but there's not very much CO2 in the atmosphere here. So, just prima facie, you wouldn't expect a very large temperature response from CO2, particularly when you bear in mind the various non-radiative transports like Eschenbach tropical afternoon convection with warming in the tropics, which the models simply don't allow for, and which pretty much cancel out the global warming signal in the one place that really matters, the engine room of the climate, which is the tropics.
For the layman, is it true that if we were to double CO2 from here and to leave everything else the same and let things settle out, do you predict a little over 1 degree centigrade of warming from that?
Well, it's if you use feedback analysis, you can't predict at all. If you use the 4 separate methods we have used in the paper, then you tend to get sort of between 1 and 2.5 Celsius. And frankly, that's just nothing to worry about. We're already, after all, at 1.5 in terms of the total warming that has happened since 1850. Has this led to the catastrophes that the Communist Front, which is the Potsdam Institute, first thought would happen when they proposed to the climate conference in Copenhagen that the figure should be not 2 Kelvin to be prevented, but 1.5? The fact is, it's already at 1.5, and the planet's just fine. Thank you very much. There's plenty of ice in the Arctic for the cuddly polar bears. There's even more ice in the Antarctic. Indeed, the problem there is cold and not heat. And is the sea level rising? Yes, but at a rate of between 2 and 6 inches a century. It's not enough to cover his spats when you're going out to dinner. The whole thing is basically nonsense. And it's astonishing that the intellectual vacuity of the political class in the West has allowed the communists to foist this nonsense onto us and rigorously to enforce it, so that the politicians are actually now frightened of coming out and saying what nonsense this is. It took me months to persuade Nigel Farage, for instance, that he should finally come out and say, we're not going to play with this net zero nonsense anymore. And this is proving wildly popular with the electorate. And he's just had, even though now won a dozen local authorities in the recent local elections, and the current forecast is that the Reform Party under Nigel Farage will win the next general election outright, and he could end up as Prime Minister. And one of the most important policies that is getting him there is the rejection of net zero, because it's unachievable, it's absurdly expensive, and now, thanks to our result, it's entirely unnecessary anyway.
So you've probably heard this question a lot, but back in the day, did you have time to sit down with Margaret Thatcher and talk to her in detail about the global warming issue, about the CO2?
Only very briefly, because it was just emerging on the horizon at that time. And I had spotted it, and I said to her, we need to keep an eye on this one. But I don't really see very much of a problem. It's just one to be watched. However, my successor as scientific advisor, who in fact knew no science at all, got very overexcited by it all. And he wrote her speech at the UN where she said, it's going to warm by, 1 Celsius degree every 10 years unless we shut down the economies of the West, or words to that effect. And of course, it hasn't done that, even though our economies haven't been shut down. So it was unfortunate that she was misled by him. And she did eventually realize that, because she came to dinner with us some years later. She said, God, that global warming thing's turned out to be nonsense, hasn't it? I said, yes, it has. So she knew by the end that she'd been hornswoggled. But it's very interesting how Trump was really the best. He was so quick. His chief of communications got in touch out of the blue. He just said, we've heard of this. We've seen your paper in the bulletin of the Chinese Academy of Sciences. Incidentally, has been downloaded more often by a factor 12 than any other paper in the 65-year history of that journal. 75 years now. So it's quite, and there we just suggested there was something, a single paragraph. Indeed, one of our co-authors said, don't include that paragraph. It's too speculative. I said, no, there is something wrong with the way they're handling feedback. I can smell it. I don't know what it is, but we should just hint that there's clearly something wrong there, because we can see by other means that it's wrong. So we left it in, and that's why he eventually got savaged by the left, because they know perfectly well we're right about this, and they're terrified that this will get out, and they're doing everything they can to stop it. And you see the mindset of your typical climate establishment. Take, for instance, the president of the Royal Society, who is a statistician. He was asked the other day, is it possible that we might be wrong about this climate thing and it isn't going to be a problem? This is what he said. He said, the question of the climate is closed. You are not allowed to question any aspect of the official narrative. Now, when you get closed minds like that, science does not advance. And so eventually, the only way to deal with these people, you can debate with them all you like, if they will even debate you. And of course, the left basically won't debate because they know they lose if they do. That's why they're now so much against free speech. But if you debate with them, they will eventually realize that we are right about this. And there will come a point where it will become so embarrassing to have overlooked this particular mistake and to go on pretending that you can't question the climate narrative, that one by one they will just slink away from it. It's a slow process by which a new paradigm becomes established. It's only when the old paradigm becomes altogether untenable that new paradigm comes in. And so I think that we're not quite yet at the point where everybody realizes that the official narrative is untenable. But on the economic side, there is a growing realization that it is untenable. I mean, it's relatively easy to calculate, though until we sat down and did it, nobody had, that even if the whole world, rather than just a few Western countries, actually went in a straight line from current emissions to net zero by 2050, global temperature would have fallen by then by just 0.1 Celsius degree. But if it's only the Western countries, now not including America because they rightly opted out, who go on trying to do this, make that 0.01 Celsius degrees. And that would cost, if the whole world did this, it would cost $2 quadrillion. And that's based, and that's 20 years of everything the world makes and sells worldwide. 20 years global GDP is what it would cost you just to get to net zero once. But then you've got to do it again every 10 or 15 years because your average solar panel gets fried after that time. The average wind farm, as the French have just discovered greatly to their cost, backs up after 15 years. And they've just had to close their offshore wind farm in the Channel because it's broken. And it's only been there 15 years and it's useless. They've now got to start again. And you can't do it anyway. Professor Simon Michaud of the Geologian Tutkimus Keskus, which is the Finnish Geological Survey, got in touch with me just the other day. He said, do you realize that the techno-metals to do lithium-ion batteries and vanadium casings and all these, we don't have the techno-metals to do even one generation of net zero. He said, just to get to one generation of net zero, and then you have to do the same every 15 years, you would need 9,500 years worth of the entire global output of lithium from all the lithium mines in the world. And he said for vanadium, which you need for vanadium batteries and also for vanadium steel casings, you would need 67,000 years worth of the entire global output. So he said it can't be done anyway. The only way, if you really want to do this, is to go properly nuclear. And that means, again, the Western countries are going to have to learn to deal with their irrational fear of nuclear power, which per terawatt hour generated has killed fewer people than any other form of power, including windmills, which tend to throw off their blades and kill people. And because they have such low energy density, the deaths from windmills per terawatt hour generated are more than for any other form of generation. And besides, if you add any wind and solar power to a grid, then what happens is that causes more warming per terawatt hour generated than if you generated the same amount of electricity with a coal-fired power station and calculated what the warming from the CO2 would be. That's how bad it is. Why is this? It's because you have to have condensers and inverters and transformers standing between the wind and solar farms and the grid. Because the wind and the solar power is not like coal-fired power. It just runs continuously for 60, 80, 100 years without really needing ever to shut it down. These wind and solar, they're changing all the time. I mean, every night the sun goes down and the wind drops. Any sailor will tell you those two happen together. There's a sailor listening to me. I'm giving this now, and he's nodding. And so then you have to keep the grid balanced with all this variable power going in. That's what all these boxes do, these transformers and inverters and condensers. And they are all formidably exothermic. They emit heat directly to the atmosphere. And because of the very low energy density that is causing this heat to be emitted, if you add wind and solar to a grid, you actually add to global warming more than you would if you built a coal-fired power station. And so the whole thing is crazy, but it gets even crazier. because in the many Western countries, Britain among them, we have actually installed more nameplate capacity of wind and solar power on the grid than the entire mean total hourly demand on the grid. So what that means is that if you add any more, you vastly increase the cost of electricity on the grid, because although the left are still trying to say that wind and solar are the cheapest form of electricity, they're actually far and away the most expensive. But also, you destabilize the grid. Spain, for instance, has got twice as much wind and solar on its grid as the entire mean hourly demand. It's Douglas Pollock in Chile that worked all this out for us. He knows this, backwards. If you haven't had him on, you should, because he's very.
I have, yeah.
Oh, you have? Well, that's good. And he came up with it. And so the Spaniards have got twice as much as they should. That's why their grid collapsed. Our grid here came very near to collapse a few weeks ago, because there just isn't enough real electricity on the grid. It's always down for wind and solar. And can you imagine that the United Kingdom has less sunshine than the Arctic? We have less sunshine than almost any other country. There is one other somewhere that has less than us, but I can't think which it is for the moment. And they try to put solar panels here. I mean, how likely is that to be useful? And so, but even so, we are now overbuilt. We are now 30% overbuilt with wind and solar. And all that happens if you add more is up shoots the cost of electricity. In Britain, we now have the most expensive industrial electricity in the world. As a result, our manufacturing industries are collapsing, and the Confederation of British Industry, which has previously towed the line on the climate rubbish, is now beginning to say, hang on a moment, we cannot any longer stay in business if you charge this much for electricity. Why are they charging this much for electricity? Entirely because of global warming policies. If they did away with all that rubbish and had a free market and you could build coal-fired or gas-fired or nuclear, whatever you wanted, then there would be virtually no wind and solar. Everybody would be getting proper electricity, and the price of electricity would be 1/6 of what it is today. And what is more, our electricity is literally 6 times more expensive than it is in China, Russia, India, Pakistan. How can we hope to compete on the world stage? We, the cradle of the Industrial Revolution, if we make our electricity to drive the machines so expensive that nobody can afford to do anything, particularly heavy manufacturing. It's dying completely in this country. And that means working people are being flung out of jobs. And I don't like that. And it's really when Nigel Farage finally got the point that the Port Talbot Steelworks, the last major steelworks producing virgin steel, had gone under because it wasn't allowed to use coking coal because global warming. And so it can't produce virgin steel anymore. We now have virtually no virgin steel anywhere being produced in Britain. If we had a war, our retiring chief of staff said the other day, he said we could fight it for 1 week as long as it was a small war, because after that we'd run out of material and we do not have the steelworks to replace it. We're completely at the mercy of the rest of the world. The trouble is, Mr. Putin knows this. And that's why he's getting aggressive now in Europe, because he knows that most European countries are in the same boat. They have tiny defense forces. They have very little equipment. They cannot now replace the equipment they've got because they've all shut down their steel manufacturing because it's too expensive. You go to the Ruhr Valley now, you don't see the great smoke coming up from there from all the steelworks. It's gone. I gave a talk there a couple of years ago. It was heartbreaking. That entire engine of German prosperity has disappeared. So in the end, the West is going to have to wake up and smell the coffee or go under. And that's why when we looked at this strategically, we decided the way to deal with this was to look very carefully at the science, as they call it. If the science was right, well, okay, we might have to accept that we, and then therefore the rest of the world, would have to shut down their economies and basically go back to, an agricultural hunter-gatherer sort of existence. As it happens, it is rubbish, and that's what our paper shows. The whole thing is baseless. The whole thing is based on this crude, elementary, gross, and highly significant error of physics. And once everybody realizes that, then I think the left will have nowhere to go. And they're going to have to accept that just as America is very, very rapidly rebuilding her industrial economy under Donald Trump, So we will all have to do the same. And if one reads the whinging note that was put in, I mean, it's 120 pages of it, but on behalf of these children who are the nominal plaintiffs in this case against the Trump executive orders on climate, Butte, Montana, of all places, you'll see how very upset they are at the speed with which not only he, but virtually every arm of his government has got on with dismantling this apparatus of climate nonsense. Now, he would only have said that they should do that if he had been satisfied by his own advisors on climate and on control theory that we were right about this. And so one by one, world leaders are going to realize that this is all nonsense. And one by one, they're going to do what he has done, because that way they'll have some chance of saving their economies and at the same time saving the planet, because after all, CO2 is the gas of life. That's what makes the plants and the trees grow. And we feed off those, and so do the animals that we also feed off. And so without the CO2, and Patrick Moore, puts this very effectively, if we waited another couple of million years or so, there would be so little CO2 left in the atmosphere that all the plants would die. And then he said, so would we. That would be the end of life on Earth as we know it. So the fact that we have staved that off by putting back into the atmosphere just a little fraction of the, I think it was 7,000 parts per million that used to be in the atmosphere in the Precambrian. I remember it well, not too young to remember. But, the planet was very lush then, and it's becoming lush now. But now we only have 430 parts per million in the atmosphere, not 7,000. And is the planet frying? Well, it didn't fry then. It ain't going to fry now either. This whole thing is a tissue of nonsense. And the only reason that it persists is that it is greatly to the political advantage of the growing nexus of totalitarian countries. The communist ones, the fascist ones, the Iranians, you've got all the Arab extreme dictatorships. Those are the ones that are now joining forces under the sort of BRICS umbrella, if you like, to replace Western hegemony with no small part of their strategy is to peddle this global warming nonsense in the West without doing a thing about it in their own countries, other than a mere window dressing to make it look as though they're doing something, while they endlessly build more and more coal-fired power stations. And they are doing this quite cheerfully because they know that if they can promote the climate nonsense through their agents of influence in the West, then we will destroy our economies, they will take over, and the world will not be a happier place if democracy and liberty and free markets and free speech are once again taken away from us. There's an awful warning in the history of England. The first modern totalitarian monarch was arguably King Henry VIII. And I was looking up just the other day, how many people did he have executed? And it was between 35,000 and 70,000, because totalitarianism is the cult of mass death. They will kill by abortion. They will kill by euthanasia. They will kill by just outright arresting and hanging people. Kill, kill, kill. That's what totalitarianism always ends up with. And that's what must always be fought by those of us who love the freedom, the democracy, the liberty, the freedom to speak as we are speaking now. They are trying to take this away. In Britain, they already have. If I were to go to the nearest railway station, stand outside it, and read from the book of Genesis, I would be arrested, dragged from my stool, taken to a police station, interrogated for 13 hours, released with a warning that I would probably be arrested again and eventually brought up before a magistrate for reading the Christian Bible, which has been read blamelessly in this country for well over 1,000 years. That's how freedom of speech has. This actually happened to a Methodist preacher outside Uxbridge railway station just last year. And I wrote to the then commissar of the Metropolitan Police and said, I don't expect this to be happening again. And those policemen who did that, they injured him, they threw him to the ground, injured him, dragged him off to the police station, interrogated him without a lawyer for 13 hours, and only then let him go. All he had done was somebody had complained because they were passing away reading from the first chapter of the book of Genesis, and it simply said, male and female created he them. And if you know your Bible, he was talking about the animals at the time. But that was enough. That's anti-transgender, and therefore this is a criminal offence. And that's how it is in Britain now. It's very much in the sort of, rather like as it was in the pre-Nazi era in Germany, with the Nazis getting more and more aggressive, shutting down freedom of speech, not allowing debate, getting violent if the debate went the wrong way. That's happening in Britain now more and more. And it's the left that are driving it, just as it was in Germany. The left have tried very hard to make out that the fascism of Hitler was right-wing, but it wasn't. It was left-wing. It was the National Socialist Workers' Party of Germany. And it is the totalitarianism, whether it's fascist or communist or Islamist, those are the three big strands in it at the moment, that is dangerous because it kills people. In fact, communism has killed somewhere between 130 million and 250 million people in just 100 years. And that is more people that have been killed by all political systems in human history added together. And yet in our schools and universities, that fact is not being taught. And communism is being taught as though it were a good thing. So that's why it is necessary to fight things like this climate battle, because this is one of their main weapons for shutting down the economies of the West. And I, for one, for as long as I have life and breath, will be saying to these people, go back into your noisome lairs. We will have our freedom. We will have our coal-fired and gas-fired and oil-fired, both static and locomotive energy. And we will not allow you to trash our economies by the deceit that is the narrative about global warming. Your day is done because your science is wrong, and our paper is perhaps the primary proof of that fact.
All right. Thank you very much, Christopher Monckton. This is a good stopping point. I appreciate what you're doing, and I hope to have you on again.
Well, Tom, it's been a real pleasure. And once again, warmest congratulations on all that you do in this fight for our freedom.